What are you seeing in the US in terms of pricing currently? Do you think that the worst is over and US generics prices have started to stabilize?
If you look at the pharma situation over the last 2 decades in America, say from 2000 to 2020, you've seen both phases. If you look at the phase between 2001 and 2005, you found that it was actually pretty, very, well poised for the generic pharma. Pricing was fairly good. Between 2005 and 2009, there was, in fact, a sharp reduction in prices. That was because of various reasons. Again, this picked up between 2011 and 2015. You found, in fact, there were a lot of tailwinds. In fact, pricing was very good. Prices didn't come down very sharply. But in 2015, a lot of things really happened. First was the introduction of Gidufa. And that obviously meant a lot more generic competition itself. The second most important part which happened was essentially customer consolidation. And coming out of that was essentially consolidation of the channel partners out there. There was the Walgreens Boots Alliance, Red Oak, which is essentially a combination of CVS and Cardinal, and McKesson Claris. That is essentially McKesson and Walmart coming together. It actually meant that a lot more bargaining power went to, in fact, the channel partners. And that meant, in fact, lower prices for the industry itself. But things have stabilized, very much stabilized since then. And today I would say that there's, again, a very stable situation. It really depends on the portfolio, the product that you have in the market. Older products, in fact, they are pretty stable. And that's possibly because of API prices also going up a bit. So you find prices to be fairly stable. Products that you've introduced, say, in the last couple of years, there's, of course, a little volatility there. There's a lot more price reduction there. And, of course, the products that you introduced very recently, you find a lot more price reduction. Overall, I would say that, pricing is stable and it will be in the low single digits for days to come, for quarters to come.
Okay, a couple of more questions on the pricing front. I mean, for the last, few years, we saw that US pricing was down, giving a negative operating leverage. Do you think that's going to change and perhaps a 10 to 12% sustainable growth will also offer a chance to have a positive operating leverage? Or if you're saying it'll still stay in lower digits, even though it's stable, is that still a possibility? And also post-COVID, is there a chance for more of an uptick, but considering people may be spending more on healthcare and medication?
One other thing which really has happened is that a lot of competition is essentially from India today. If you look at, in fact, the America situation, Teva, which had a market share of close to about 25% way back in 2010, has got a market share of just about 9% in America. Likewise, Mylan, which had a market share of close to about 12%, is down to just 4%. Sandoz is down from 7% to 3%. There, of course, have been a lot of new entrants into that market from India. Vajanta, Alchem, Alembic, Torrent, which have also expanded their portfolio and the like. So it's really, the competition is amongst the Indians. But the Indian companies, which are the smaller companies that have got into the fray, have also realized that the return on capital employed is not as easy as they thought it was going to be. It is because there's a lot of, you've got to invest in FDA-approved facilities, manufacturing facilities of a different kind and the like. There is a waiting period for getting your ANDAs approved and so on. And there is, of course, working capital blockage. So all of that meant that, so they've also, once they are there in the markets, the ROC is not as what they kind of expected, I would imagine. And so to that extent, some of them are also backing off in some ways. So I would think the competition there is going to be less intense. And for that very reason, you would find some price stability in the market for several quarters to come.
Hi Ramesh, morning. Nikunj Dalmia also tuning in. Good to connect with you. Ramesh, if I could divide the portfolio of Lupin or for that matter, any pharma company, it is chronic, it is acute and it is specialty.
Right.
Acute is where everybody is present. Chronic is where some would say there's limiting pricing power. But specialty is where the real margins and the pricing power is there. Lupin in the past has attempted to move into the specialty drug space, and something which all pharma companies are doing and something which Lupin has also attempted. Now this is a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old conversation, but that has not translated into great margins, better pricing power, or a huge uptake in your portfolio. Why is that? What is stopping you from moving up the value chain?
I would nuance it further, Nikhil, if you don't mind. Really, when you come to, in fact, the conventional products, so there is a lot more competition out there. In the last several years, Lupin and, for that matter, the bigger companies are kind of are focusing on delivering on what they would call as more complex generics, so to speak. And this includes, in fact, complex injectables, the inhalations piece, and the like. In fact, the growth really is out there. Complex injectables, and it's growing at over 6 to 7%. Inhalations is growing over 15%. And the next frontier really is biosimilars. So a lot of this, and all of these, in fact, would have limited competition because there's fair degree of complexity associated with it. Complexity in terms of the way development takes place, in terms of manufacture, in terms of regulatory affairs. And of course, it also calls for clinical trials, and all of this obviously means a lot more difficulty in getting to the market itself. The competition for these products is going to be limited. And that is where, in fact, the bigger companies are really focusing on. That apart from, in fact, specialty. But specialty is a different story altogether. We can take that separately. I think, with, in fact, a lot of these products coming into market over the next, in fact, a few years, I would imagine the pricing to be the realizations from the point of view of, in fact, the generic companies in India would be much better. So the future really is into, the more complex products. I'll talk a little more about biosimilars. And I honestly feel that this, in fact, the next frontier for several reasons. And of course, the sunrise industry insofar as, the Indian companies are concerned. The first is essentially because there are high entry barriers for getting into, in fact, biosimilars. Each of these molecules would potentially cost us anything between $50 to $60 million, including the clinical trials. And of course, there is this considerable difficulty in getting it right also. But once you actually have a clone, get your characterization right, if you've done your immunogenicity studies well, and of course, if you get your PK studies well enough, then you would potentially have, in fact, the development risk is to that extent mitigated. Then, of course, you have, in fact, the market risk. I would imagine, given the situation there and the competition being just about 4 to 5, maximum level of discounts that you would find there is potentially, you would find a pricing of at least 30 to 35% of the originator price, which is not the way it is for, in fact, the smaller molecules. And once you get to that, today biosimilars are not, have not really picked up, in terms of the American market itself. There are about 19 biosimilars in Europe. Europe, in fact, has adapted more to, in fact, biosimilars. The American market is still about picking up. Once it does, in fact, the realizations for players in that market would be certainly much higher. I could talk about specialty also, but that's a very different, it's a cup of tea altogether. Firstly, you need to look at, deep pockets. That's because it calls for a very different kind of an approach. It calls, of course, for a sales force. And most important is that you need to have, in fact, a product which meets, it actually, meets unmet demand as yet. There's, of course, the innovation quotient, which is extremely important, and clinical data. And most importantly, in fact, you require a lot of patience. You alluded to, in fact, Lupin, and we got into women's health because that was one space that was being vacated by in fact, the big pharma. And to that extent, the competition there is much lower. In the past, we have met with a lot of success with, in fact, products like Suprax, and with the Gene and a couple of other products there. But in recent times, we actually bought Solosec a couple of years ago, but it's still early days, and we are also learning through our, our own experience. And today, with, in fact, the COVID situation, I believe there have been a lot more learnings in the way we think we should be promoting that product. We will be focusing on, in fact, the high prescribers with a much reduced sales force to rationalize on costs. And we still have a lot of hope in that product. We believe in its potential.
Fair point. Fair point. So, Ramesh, allow me to just come in and change the topic here now that we've got your views on specialty. Is that I want to go back to that whole China part once again, whereas India exports or manufactures 35% of the total generic medicines which are available in the world now, and that's a great proud moment for us. we are still dependent on raw material for API from China, and different companies have different data, which is that anywhere between 50 to 65% of the total raw material for APIs is coming from China. Now that this rhetoric against China has started, how challenging would that be for Indian companies? Because when you are exporting any pharma company, as per the dossier, you have to also disclose the availability of the raw material. And for anybody to change the supply of raw material for API from China to any other country is going to be a painful process. So do you think this entire Atmanirbhar or China rhetoric, anti-China rhetoric, could actually cost Indian pharma companies dearly in the short term?
Well, obviously, China is a big player insofar as the chemical market is concerned. Well, obviously, the situation for various companies is very different. A lot of them actually depend on, in fact, China for key starting materials, perhaps for bulk materials, for excipients and the like as well. You speak about Lupin. In fact, the actual import of API is very much on the lower side. So we work on other chemicals really. But if you really want to replace China as the producer for the world, it is going to be a medium to long-term story. India has about 25% of the API capacities in terms of US FDA capacities in the world, but it's still some way to go when it comes to, in fact, supply. We still rely on that. Whilst the rhetoric is there, the intent is there, it really has to be aided by, in fact, the right atmosphere, and obviously the government today is trying to encourage that. But the investments has to be forthcoming, and I would imagine that it certainly happen given the thrust today and the anti-China factor, so to speak, across the globe, including India. So I would think that the API industry would certainly bounce back in the next couple of years, so to speak, in terms of greater investment being made into this area.
Sure. Ramesh, do you think faster monetization of the complex R&D pipeline, and I'm talking at an industry level here, success in specialty drugs, that is, are now the key to watch for Indian pharmaceutical sector, and that somewhere sort of, puts companies such as you in leadership position along with the Dr. Reddy's and Sun Pharma, your peer groups?
Sorry, I didn't get your question on this. So essentially, faster approvals, of course, would be highly desirable. But obviously, when it comes to the complex ones, the FDA itself is kind of evolving through its guidelines and so on. They're of course being aided by newer technologies and the like. But they're thinking in a lot of this is still evolving in some ways. So to the extent, I think it is going to take time for approvals to come through. There are always perspectives and views about the way one has to look at pathways for, and how actually generics really work when it comes to some of these complex ones.
But largely, would you say that Indian pharma is in good stead? I mean, are all the pricing control issues, demonetization, GST one-time hit, are all those aberrations now behind us? And also, like you said, with faster A&D approvals coming in, are the tailwinds now well in favor of the sector as the market seems to be believing?
I would think so too. At least there are three growth engines, so to speak, for this market, for this industry. One is, of course, the large American market, and with a host of those complex ones that you're getting into, it's certainly a very lucrative market. Second is, and the most important, of course, is the India piece itself. India, is still a pretty vastly underpenetrated market. Despite, in fact, a lot of the pressures in recent times, including Jan Aushadhi and the like. India, I think, is still good for growth for several decades to come. There's been a lot of emphasis so far on affordability, but I think with the more access to healthcare and of course awareness of healthcare, and this COVID situation has helped in some ways, there is going to be a thrust from the Indian government and potentially a lot more awareness from the public itself. It should certainly set the grounds for faster growth out here. And there's of course a piece on the emerging markets. There's several markets which have not been, they're still in some ways white spaces, so to speak, because a lot of the focus so far has been on America. So we could look at, the other emerging markets, and as long as you get your strategies right, and in fact, and if you get your act right with the portfolio, you should make good there as well. So I would think that Indian pharmaceutical industry is well poised for growth for some time to come.
Okay. So definitely saying that India is in a sweet spot, and the pharma sector at least is in a sweet spot for growth over the next few years. While we're talking about the growth outlook, if Ramesh, if you could just sum up like really the key advantages you see there, whether it be on the R&D side, the approval side, but where you really think that Philips is going to come from.
It is going to be from the R&D side in terms of, so I think insofar as our ability to churn out newer products is still being tested. When it comes to Lupin, for example, we have at least a couple of those molecules that are out licensing, but it's still work in progress on that. Whilst on, the immediate prospects, I should also talk about the fact that the COVID situation might not necessarily, it would actually be impacting the demand situation in some ways, both in India and in America. In fact, where we talk about the situation, though of course I think the H2 and the years to come are certainly going to be great. The H1 situation could be a little lackluster. I think principally because demand is lower in India, as we are seeing in the first quarter, possibly because of supply disruptions. In some ways, logistics has been impacted, packing material shortage in some ways, and all of that, and of course demand itself. So you might find some contraction in the industry when it comes to India. And I would say the same thing about America as well, where in fact you have found some contraction in terms of prescriptions, both on the chronic side as well as on the acute side, more on the acute though. But I do honestly feel it's a very temporary situation, potentially last out only for the first or potentially for the second quarter. And things would certainly pick up from there. The second half for sure would be much better.
As we look into future, Ramesh, final question. There are going to be huge advantage which all countries are now giving to local manufacturing. If you are a local company, you get advantage on tender. If you're a local company, you don't have to pay what is called as the crawlback tax. How do you plan to tackle these basic issues?
You're absolutely spot on. The flavor of the day seems to be nationalistic fervor. And this seems to be resonating across the globe. You have it in India, you have it in America with the current president, and you have it in other parts also. If you speak, for example, Lupin, we have also been conscious of this for quite some time, and we have, in most of these countries where we are operating, we actually have, in fact, local manufacturing as well. Of course, the basic paradigm is low-cost manufacturing in India and exporting to the rest of the globe. But there are, in fact, manufacturing facilities that we have acquired or set up in other parts. We have a facility at Somerset in America. Likewise, in our operations for Brazil, we have a pretty large plant out there. When it comes to Mexico, we've got a pretty large plant out there as well. So I think that model is what is going to stand as in good stead potentially for Indian pharma. You need to actually have the basic paradigm of manufactured from India, but you should certainly supplement that with, in fact, local manufacture. And you would do that perhaps for, depending on the product, the portfolio that you have and so on. But that for sure is the way to go.